The first weird thing I noticed when testing out the new Forza Motorsport is that FSR and DLSS don't seem to be working correctly. And I saw this reported online, but usually when I see people report this, I assume that they're CPU limited, but I promise I'm not CPU limited and I can actually prove that. So what are we looking at here? And again, I was testing this out primarily because, I mean, first of all, I test upscaling the game anyway. But also when I was looking at people's reports on PC performance, like I saw headlines like this: Forza Motorsport poor PC performance overshadows launch. It's not looking great for PC players ahead of the blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the point is, there was mixed reports here because I also saw a whole bunch of other people saying game runs fine for me. And I mean, this happens around a lot of game launches, but I did specifically see people saying that FSR and DLSS are broken, not really improving performance. And usually when they aren't improving performance, it's because you're CPU limited. Now, this is on a 7800X3D based system, so that in and of itself indicates we're probably not CPU limited. Also, we are GPU usage at 100%, basically, and the game benchmark at the end of this section also reports that we are GPU limited on both sides here. And again, notice I do have it enabled, and if some of you are wondering, see this FSR off, this is FSR performance. And if some of you are wondering if I forgot to restart the game, because that's another big thing that people have been reporting, is if you don't restart the game when you change almost anything. Like most games, you can change DLSS or FSR or the resolution or various other settings, and only certain settings require a restart. Some games don't require a restart at all. Yeah, I did absolutely fully restart the game before doing this, and we can see that the performance is 4 FPS better, 39 to 43, going from native 1440p to FSR2 performance, which would be an internal resolution of 720p. I have never seen this terrible of scaling, so something obviously seems to be broken with that setting. And I'll get to DLSS as well, but also, why am I testing the RX 6800 XT here to begin with? Well, we could talk about the game's PC system requirements. This is from the game's website. And the recommended, for recommended specs, I do have an RX 6800 XT, so I went ahead and tested that out. The recommended NVIDIA GPU is the RTX 2080 Ti. Later in this video, I will test out the recommended CPU, the 5600X. I don't have an 11600K. But for the baseline minimum specs, I will be testing a 1066 gigabyte, along with, I don't have an i5 8400, but I do have an i5 9600K. There wasn't a huge jump in performance generationally there, but mine is a little bit better than that. And then I don't have a 5800X CPU, but I do have a 5950X, which does have double the cores, but this game doesn't really use the extra cores anyway. By the way, if you want more info than what I've got here, Digital Foundry, and if you're more into text-based articles, Eurogamer has an excellent analysis of this game already. And they're showing that, you know, having the extra cores is not really giving you much scaling here in the game. So it's not really core hungry anyway. So I've got something similar to that. We'll test out a whole bunch of stuff in this video, including a 4080 running on a system that's similar to this 5800X. Anyway, I also tested an RTX 3060 because I know a lot of people have those and were interested. So let's dive back into the tests that I did run now that you've kind of seen the system requirements. Anyway, here's to prove that I was not CPU limited. So this is the RTX 4090 on the same CPU, the 7800X3D, same RAM, same everything. It's at 1440p max settings, which does include ray tracing. Did have DLSS quality enabled just to ensure that we were gonna get to some high frame rates, assuming DLSS is even working. But the point is here, we are hitting over 100 frames per second on this system. Here's the full benchmark stats. We can stop here for a second. Now, this is actually still very GPU limited much of the time, despite this being a 4090. So the point is here, the 7800X3D based system I was using is not the reason, it cannot explain why the 6800 XT only gained 3 or 4 frames per second when enabling FSR2 performance mode, because I'm on that same CPU. So it cannot be a CPU issue. It just has to be a problem running that. Now, we do see that on a high-end system, yeah, you can run this game over 100 frames per second and all that, no problems. And I did go ahead and choose to also test out, since I had the 4090 in the system anyway, let's go ahead and see what the 4090 can do at 4K max settings, again, including all the ray tracing stuff. This is still on the 7800X 3D. And we are up, and this is native 4K. I do not have DLSS on, and we're averaging, in the upper 80s during the benchmark run. And the benchmark run is actually more demanding than a lot of the normal gameplay I tested. Now, granted, I only played the game for, 30 minutes or so of the normal gameplay, but just mainly to compare it to the benchmark run to make sure the benchmark run was a valid way to test the game. And it seemed like it worked out to me from what I saw so far. Now, I don't want you guys to get the impression that 6800 XT can't run this game well, although I also wanted to test out FSR again. So this is the 6800 XT at 1440p. I'm going to call it Ultra. There's not really graphics presets in this game exactly, but this is basically just the same max settings, but I turned ray tracing off. Here we're seeing that we can definitely average over 60 frames per second. We'll stop on this for a second here. By the way, you might see ray tracing is off. Ray tracing quality is off. It still says RTAO quality at Ultra, but I tested that. You can't turn that one off. You can turn it down to low, but I think if you turn the total ray tracing settings to off, that is off. And I did run a benchmark with the RTAO at low with this off, and I didn't see any performance differences. Anyway, point is here that we are showing that the recommended specs for the game, the 6800 XT, is good for if you turn off ray tracing, an over 60 FPS experience on that GPU. So that seems to be what you're getting out of it. So kind of confirming those system requirements if you were hoping for, 1440p max without ray tracing on the recommended GPU, the 6800 XT. And again, though, with FSR2 quality enabled, and you can see that is enabled right there in the graphics settings, and this is... like I said, I restarted the game fully in between that settings change. We see 1 frame per second difference between these runs. So once again, it looks like more evidence that FSR just doesn't seem to be working correctly. I also wanted to test out an RTX 3060. It didn't show up on the system requirements list, but this is a very common GPU. This is testing the game out at 1080p at the max settings, all of the ray tracing enabled. On the left-hand side here, we are native 1080p. On the right-hand side, I enabled DLSS quality, but our performance numbers here are only 2 frames per second better on the DLSS quality side of the scene during the built-in benchmark. And again, if we check here, I really did enable DLSS quality is off on the left, DLSS quality is on the right. And I don't know what to tell you guys. Again, I fully restarted the game in between, and we're on the 7800X 3D, which we've proven can run at 100 frames per second or more at these settings. So, I don't know. Yeah, DLSS certainly seems to be broken. Now, I did want to check how the RTX 3060 could do if I turned off ray tracing. So this is everything maxed out except RT off. And again, I wanted to test out DLSS again, so native on the left, DLSS quality on the right. Here we're getting a 4 frames per second improvement from DLSS quality. Again, that's way below what you would expect, but hey, at least we are averaging around 60 frames per second during the benchmark at 1080p ultra settings, just with ray tracing turned off. Anyway, here's where we jump to the next CPU test. So to be clear, again, if we compare to the system requirements chart, we're now jumping to the Ryzen 5 5600X, which was the recommended AMD CPU for the game. So what I'm looking for when I'm CPU testing is I do have a 4090 in here, but we're not really looking at the 4090. I'm just putting in a GPU that is so much more powerful than the CPU and running it at a low resolution to further not stress the GPU. That, again, we can see the GPU here is only utilized about 70% in this particular freeze frame. The point is we're seeing the limits of the Ryzen 5 5600X I have mine with some pretty generic, not super expensive RAM or anything like that. And this is max settings, including ray tracing, and ray tracing does have a big impact on CPU, not just GPU. And we are averaging around 70 frames per second, but you guys can see the 1% lows are down in the 40s, and they are these little stutters throughout the run. So it is something to keep in mind. Again, built-in benchmark saying 71 frames per second. The biggest thing I would say, if you seem to be CPU limited, is that turning off ray tracing, if you had it on, helps a lot. You can see here that at 1080p Ultra with ray tracing off, my average here is much more up into the 80s. And again, everything else is exactly the same. Once again, yeah, it's a 4090, but we're CPU limited. The 4090 is only under 50% utilized at these settings. However, while our averages are pretty good, the 1% lows here are down around 51, so still not amazing 1% lows. I would like to see that a little bit better. And again, I did want to show that I did actually test the game out, not just in the benchmark mode. So this is the Ryzen 5 5600X, again, CPU limited performance. This is just one of the initial game races it has you do right at the very intro of the game. But comparing that to the benchmark was more demanding than this, not less. So it seems like the benchmark is fairly representative of a more demanding than just randomly racing around in the intro of the game, at least kind of setting in the game. We don't need to watch this forever, so let me go ahead and jump to the next test that I was running. So I was also interested in other CPUs. So again, if we jump back to this system requirement list, it does say the i5 8400 for the minimum CPU. Now, I have the oldest Intel CPU I have is the i5 9600K. One generation newer than this, but there wasn't a massive performance jump between those generations to my knowledge. But again, this is a slightly better CPU than the minimum recommendation, is basically what we're looking at here. This is the 4070 Ti GPU, but we're not really looking at the GPU here. I have it running at settings that are not fully utilizing the GPU. So in other words, we're looking at the CPU performance here. This is the i5 9600K. This has 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3000CL15 memory. And this is max ray tracing, which is more demanding than without ray tracing. And we're averaging over 60 frames per second with 1% lows down in the 40s. But I was expecting worse CPU performance here with ray tracing enabled, to be honest. I really was. But yeah, this is not actually terrible. But I was curious, what if we went for more optimized CPU settings? So the settings here, I'm calling DF CPU optimized. So in the Digital Foundry video or Eurogamer article, he did a lot of testing on optimized settings, which I'm not really getting into in this video, but I will link this in the description. And he did have a mid-low CPU recommended settings, which does include ray tracing turned off, as well as a few other tweaks and things like that. So I was just kind of interested in testing it out. This is not the video I meant to go to. Here we go. So I was interested in testing that out. So this is the i5 9600K at the CPU Digital Foundry CPU optimized settings, or at least pretty sure I got pretty close to them. I don't like the graphics menu in this game. Actually watch the Digital Foundry video for a more in-depth analysis of the graphics menu in this game. It's weird. I don't like it. Anyway, averaging pretty good here, 86, and the 1% lows were actually staying up around 60, so not bad there at all. But here I decided to test out the minimum system requirements, including the GPU. So again, the CPU still the i5 9600K, which is as close as I can get to their minimum. And now I'm popping in the GTX 1060 6GB. So we're a little bit above the minimum CPU and RAM, but close-ish, and we now have the minimum GPU. First, I started out at those Digital Foundry CPU optimized settings, which does also tweak down some of the graphics settings. I was hopeful that we would do well on the 1060 at a kind of medium-ish sort of settings, but you can see here that we're down into the 20s with 1% lows down into the teens. It's honestly really terrible. Part of it is I do think we're probably over our VRAM limit. It is mentioning 6.66 out of 5.9, which, you know, not great. But here's why I was hoping for better, guys. And so this is me testing out Forza Horizon 5 on an integrated, right? This is not Forza Motorsport. This is Forza Horizon 5, the most recent Forza game that isn't this one. And this game is extremely scalable. This was me testing it out on an integrated Radeon 780M and the GTX 1066 gigabyte at native 1080p medium. This isn't even upscaled. And in this video, I was getting nearly 70 FPS from the integrated GPU, and the GTX 1060 was also actually a little bit over 70 frames per second at 1080p medium. So you see why I was maybe hopeful that we could get some sort of a medium-ish sort of decent result out of the GTX 1060, given Forza Horizon 5 was able to be over 70 frames per second at medium, right? But that just wasn't the case. It was not good. You can see the settings I had enabled here, and granted, a lot of them are at higher ultra. So this was pretty demanding settings, but it was, you know, I was hopeful. So I went down to low settings, and actually let me talk about this for a second here. Remember how I said that it's very important that you restart the game, and I have been restarting between every single setting change that you've seen, even just the DLSS, all of that. I wanted to show you guys how big of a difference it can make. So I just, on purpose, not by accident, decided to do this. So I went from those CPU optimized settings to I turned everything to low, except I think I forgot and left anisotropic filtering at 16x, but that shouldn't be that big of a deal. Anyway, so this is basically everything at low, and I chose not to restart it and filmed it, and then I restarted it and filmed it. And so in other words, the actual low setting performance here is on the right-hand side of the screen, but you can see how much worse it is without a restart. So some people saying that they're getting really bad performance, I think make sure you're actually restarting the game. This is trying to prove it. Your performance can be significantly worse if you haven't restarted the game. Yes, this is only like 12 frames per second difference, but percentage-wise, that is a massive percentage difference from a base of 24 going up to 36. You can see here that I have basically everything turned down to off and low. So here on the left, we're now seeing the properly restarted native 1080p low on the left-hand side of the screen. And then I was like, well, I know FSR2 hasn't really been working, but for one thing, let's test that again. Or at least it hasn't been working to boost frame rate much. But then also, you know, that's the only other thing I could do to try to get my poor 1060 better performance. Well, it's better by, you know, 3 frames per second going down to FSR2 performance mode. So once again, showing really poor scaling from going to FSR or you know, or DLSS, you know, scaling still doesn't seem to be working well. So what are we testing here? Now I've switched over to the RTX 4080 and I'm on my Ryzen 9 5950X based CPU. Also, this one's internal capture using the driver software because this is the PC I actually record my other footage on. Usually I use a second PC, this 5950X and 4080, to capture through an external capture card to not impact performance. So this one, just be aware it is capturing through the GPU driver software rather than separately. Now, what are we looking at compared to the system requirements here? This is the RTX 4080, which is the ideal GPU listed for the game, at least on the NVIDIA side of things. And it is similar to the 5800X CPU, which is the ideal listed AMD CPU for the game. And by the way, if you've been wondering this whole time, I've been on SSDs the whole time. The i5 9600K base system is a SATA SSD. However, on the other systems, it's been NVMe SSDs that are quite fast, like Gen 4 SSDs. Anyway, that's a bit of a side note, but the point is, here we're on the 5800X and the 4080, so basically in the ideal spec side of the chart. Now mine's not actually the 5800X, it's the 5950X, which is from that same generation, but rather than being 8-core 16-thread, it's 16-core 32-thread. But as I already mentioned, this game doesn't really scale with the extra cores, so this should be performing fairly similarly. I could have disabled 8 of the cores, but it didn't seem worth the effort for this. Anyway, this is 4K max settings on the left and max settings with DLSS quality on the right, native on the left. And 4K max, including ray tracing, we are over 60 FPS. It is the RTX 4080, which is still like $1,100. And once again, we're seeing DLSS quality not real. I mean, it does boost performance. We're going from 65 to 71, but usually we see a larger jump from that. So once again, kind of the underwhelming jump from enabling DLSS, although the 4080 was performing well. Now this test is not really about the 4080 now. Now we're looking at the 5950X. So I dropped down to 1080p settings, kept it at max everything, including ray tracing. I also enabled DLSS performance just in case it would actually relieve the burden on the GPU at all, despite it sort of not working very well. But the goal here was to get the GPU usage down below 100% so we would become CPU limited, so we could see the limitations of a CPU that is very close to what's recommended as the ideal spec, which is weaker than my 7800X 3D that we were testing earlier in the video. And at max settings, it looks like we're able to hit into the 80 FPS range with all of the RT effects enabled. But again, the 1% lows are still below 60, even on the ideal spec. Now this is with ray tracing enabled. But anyway, so this is pretty much what I've got for you guys today for Forza. So my overall thoughts are it certainly doesn't scale anywhere near as well as Forza Horizon 5 did, where I could get over 70 FPS at medium settings and close to 70 FPS on a iGPU, and the GTX 1060 was way up there. Yeah, we're nowhere like that on this. However, we did see an RTX 3060, if you turn off ray tracing, able to hit 60 FPS in the pretty demanding benchmark run. So not crazy terrible. We also saw on the CPU side of things, it can be demanding. It's not super easy or lightweight on the CPU, but we did see CPUs like the 5600X, or even going back to, like I said, the i5-9600K, still able to average around 60 frames per second, although the 1% lows are worse. So I don't think it's like, I don't know. I'm certainly not real happy with where it's at, especially the weird upscaling stuff that's happening. I'm hoping that's just like a simple patch they could fix, or like, is there some reason why we're not scaling better with that? Usually games would scale a lot better when you're not CPU limited with something as extreme as that. But yeah, my overall thoughts are, yeah, like I said, you can run it at 60 FPS on a 3060, so it's not, you know, as long as you turn off ray tracing, it's not the most demanding thing in the world, but it's also not nearly as scalable as Forza Horizon 5, so I think some people will be disappointed by that, and then there's those weird issues with the upscaling. Other than that, I have some other nitpicks with the menu and things like that, but it's late. I need to go to bed, and like I said, if you want more thoughts on things like that, I do think that the Digital Foundry video does a nice job of talking about those types of things. Anyway, I hope all of you have an excellent day.